When I was a kid, my father taught me how to read the weather by the way the sea moved. He could tell wind direction by watching whitecaps, predict a squall by the smell of iron in the air. The night he went missing, he was up to his elbows in grease fixing a busted cleat while the rest of the world argued with the sky. I remember the boat rocking harder than it should, my tiny hands gripping the dock, and then him bending to shout something to me over the roar. The storm swallowed his voice. By morning, the boat came back with the tide, but not him. That absence carved the habits that shaped me, a reluctance to trust the dark, an aversion to being alone near water after sundown. I became someone who locked doors twice, who checked the pier lights before stepping outside, who avoided late-night walks on the shore because the memory of a man walking away in a storm was a slow-burning ache in my chest. At 27, doing fieldwork and thesis papers in marine biology, I convinced myself that living a stone's throw from a pier would be good for research. It helped during daylight, transects and tide charts, algae counts, but at night the pier was a silhouette that twitched my nerves. 3 months into a winter stint in a cheap coastal rental, I had taught myself to ignore the ache. I told myself logic. Storms and lonely coastlines breed stories. The ocean is indifferent, not malevolent. But the past is patient. It waits at the edge of hearing. That December night, the house hummed with the low glow of my laptop and the occasional tick from the heater. I was deep in coral density numbers when the lights stuttered. 1 shrug, 2, then the kitchen light cutting out like someone had pinched a wire. The motion sensor over the deck blinked on and off, a steady, unnoticed annoyance until it wasn't. It kept tripping though I hadn't moved. The sound of the waves through the cracked window was routine, the sea making its slow, repeating argument with the shore. Then came the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate on the frozen wooden pier, measured like someone pacing a decision. I froze, the cursor in my document mocking me by blinking faster than I could breathe. When I peered through the blinds, I saw a silhouette, a tall figure in a coat that seemed too soaked to be warm, standing at the pier's end and looking back at the house as if he'd been watching for a while. My first thought was trespass, some kid from town, a drunk with a torch. The second was older, rawer, the dread you get when something about a scene taps the same nerve as a memory. I tried to call my landlord. No signal. The storm had more than weathered the town's weak reception. The figure moved closer, boots scraping wood. A metallic scrape followed him along the railing. I remember thinking of the break-in at the neighbor's cabin 2 weeks earlier. Marks on a door, muddy impressions left like a promise. Routines dissolve fast when the body remembers threat before the mind does. I locked every door and then stood behind the kitchen counter, like a child behind the sofa, clutching a flashlight and a flare gun I'd kept since undergrad field seasons. Dumb comfort from smarter days. He circled the house, slow, methodical, whispering a word that might have been the wind until I heard it clearly. Open. And then, Elliot. My name, clipped and soft, and the breath in my chest left me altogether. Panic drafted itself into action. The bathroom window was painted shut, some landlord economy fix, and the back door handle began to jiggle. Not tentative, but as if the man outside knew exactly how it worked. He didn't pound. He tested. He wanted me to know he could. I considered hollering, throwing something, running for the car, any movement that could end this. Instead, I fired the flare through the little window pane by the door, a sudden slash of red that tore the night into a bright wound. The flare's light revealed a face I didn't want to own. Pale, the skin cracked like dried salt, hair plastered to a skull by sea spray, eyes too wide and sleepless. For a second, the man staggered back, not so much fleeing as retreating to distance, and then he bolted toward the shore. He moved like someone headed toward the thing that made them live, the dark, the water, the place they belonged or had lost. When the police arrived 30 minutes later, they found a scrap of coat snagged on the railing and footprints leading to the pier that did not return. They told me about a fisherman gone missing weeks before, and about his boat washing up empty. They suggested theories, identity stolen, opportunity taken, but their words were just nets cast across an ocean I couldn't make sense of. Sleep after that was a scarce commodity. I moved out the next morning because the house felt like a suggestion for disaster rather than a shelter. Days blurred into a fog of coffee and library hours. I forced myself back to campus to finish the thesis work because habits are the scaffolding of sanity. But the pier had a way of following me. In quiet reading rooms, I would sense the echo of wet footsteps and look over my shoulder at walls that were as harmless as any wall could be. At night, whenever the wind shifted, I'd startle at the echo of wood scraping against wood. I told myself the sensible bits. People take jackets, wander at night, pretend to be someone else. But the other part of me cataloged oddities. The way his whisper knew my name, the way the footprints led to the pier and not away, as if whatever had come ashore decided to stay at waterline and keep its world separate from ours. Sometimes I walked the daylight pier to force the fear into context, a smart, small exposure therapy. But once the sun drops, the edge of the world still seemed like an invitation for stories to come true. Months later, the nightmares continued. In them, the man was both fisherman and shadow. He bent in the storm and didn't return. He stood on the pier waiting for a door to open. His voice called my name as if the ocean had taught him it was mine to use. Time, which is supposed to dull sharp things, only reshaped the fear into a scar. I finished my thesis. I left the coast for another research season. I told myself it was progress. I told friends I had moved on. But one late night in a campus library, eyes gritty from editing, I heard, so faint that I wondered if it was an old memory or a trick of tinnitus, wet steps behind me. I closed my laptop without deciding whether the sound was real, hugged my jacket, and walked into the brisk night. The pier was miles away, and I knew that. Still, I went home with the light on, the front door locked, keys in hand. The sea is indifferent, but people are not. Whatever had come that winter had wanted to be remembered. It succeeded. You can learn to live with loss without letting it shrink your world, but you owe it to yourself to respect the warnings your past gives you. Lock the door, call for help, and leave when your gut says to leave. Fear is not weakness, it is information. My hands still shake when I think about the week I spent in cabin 06B. People imagine I went into the woods to heal, to reconnect with nature and myself after my last show cratered and my girlfriend walked out the door. That's the shorthand version. The truth was messier. I went because I needed to prove to myself I could still make something good, and because the cabin was a place my brother and I used to haunt as kids, before he walked out of my life and never came back. The forest had been a shrine to that loss for years, something I avoided and resented all at once. I told myself this trip was practical. Finish a photo project, clear my head, sleep in a place with solid walls and a roof. Solitude, I thought, would be clean. I pulled into the gravel lot in late afternoon, the sky folding into gold and green through the pines. The cabin looked smaller than the photos online suggested. Wood, weathered by wind, a sagging porch, a stack of firewood like ribs. There was a note in the box, "Welcome, enjoy your stay," and a binder full of rules and a single line about the previous tenant leaving abruptly. I shrugged it off. People left things behind all the time. People disappeared sometimes too. That was not my problem until it was. I set up my gear, ran an extension from the generator, and spent the first 2 days shooting close studies of lichen and light, the way the forest folds in on itself. Editing on a laptop under the cabin's dim lamp felt focused in a way the city never allowed. The rhythm of my work steadied me. The camera was still the thing I trusted most. At night, I ate canned soup by the window and listened to the woods. On the third night, the generator coughed and died. The whole place blinked out like someone flipped a switch. I grabbed a flashlight, stepped onto the porch, and found boot prints circling the cabin. deep and recent, heavy into the moss as if something with mass had paced and paced. I hadn't heard a car, hadn't heard anything. There was no ranger on routine patrol for miles. I told myself a neighbor, a hunter, someone had been curious. It should have been reasonable. It didn't feel reasonable. Inside, the curtain at the main window was not as I had left it. I'd closed everything tight. I always closed everything tight. There was a faint fog on the glass where breath had warmed it from the outside. A dry snap from the woods made me freeze. I thought of any number of mundane explanations. Animals, wind, but the snapping quickly became soft, deliberate steps across dead leaves. Then something dragged on the porch. Slow, intentional. Tap, tap, tap at the window nearest me. I dialed 911 because it's what you do when you're terrified, but there was no signal. My satellite beacon could ping for help. It would tell someone roughly where I was. It was the best I could do. I crawled behind the couch, tripod in my hands like a spear, and watched the curtain breathe in small, hesitant moves. The tapping moved. 2 windows, 3, a circle around the cabin. Whoever was outside was methodical, checking exits. I told myself to hold steady, to keep breathing, to wait for daylight. The woods pressed against the thin walls with a sound like slow breath. Then a voice came from the porch, deep, rough as stone. I know this cabin. I used to live here. It wasn't a script, not an urban scare tactic. It had the cadence of memory. My stomach dropped. Memory of what? My mind asked until the words hit like a brick. The previous tenant had left everything behind. My heart thought of my brother, of the jacket he never returned in. I peeked and saw a man in a ragged parka dragging something rusted and slick. Bear trap, I realized with a stab of cold. Across the porch. He moved with a walker's certainty, laying the trap like a line in the water. He paused at the window, and then turned his head as if listening for a younger voice. "Where'd you go, little brother?" he called softly. The phrase ripped me back to being 7 again, to muddy boots and shared sandwiches, to the day my brother went on a hike and never came back. The voice was familiar and impossible. The name my brother used to call me crawled out of nowhere, Mace, and I hated it and loved it in equal parts. I don't know how long I sat there before the Rangers came, only that the night lasted like an era, and the tapping never resumed once I sent the beacon ping. When the patrol truck finally rolled up, headlights cutting the dark, the porch held evidence. Deep claw marks on the railing, the rusted bear trap laid on the steps, and a line of prints heading into the trees until they disappeared into the dark. The man was gone. They told me later they recovered gear that had belonged to my brother years ago. Old rope, a thermos, everything except one parka. My mouth went dry when the ranger said that, like someone had opened a seam inside me. Coincidence, he explained, is a real thing. People pick up old jackets, bring them home, forget them under a bed. But he didn't sound entirely conclusive. There was an angle I could not shake. The voice on the porch, the parka, the way the man called me as if from another time. In the morning, the forest looked ordinary. Light through needles, birds moving like punctuation. I left at first light. I gathered my camera and my pride, stapled them together with the memory of a night that had hollowed me out a little more. I tried to keep it practical, log a weird night in my head and move on. But moving on is rarely a straight line. The city felt too bright, too loud, like a stage where everyone acts oblivious. Since that night, I don't camp in the kind of solitude that used to feel like a sanctuary. I still photograph forests, but never overnight anymore. People ask if I saw a ghost or if I imagined it, if the grief over my brother warped me into seeing shapes where none existed. I tell the honest ones, those who ask in quiet, who look like they want to believe me, that I don't know. What I do know is simple and stubborn. The world is stranger and more dangerous than our routines tell us, and loss can make us susceptible to patterns and echoes we can't explain. Sometimes, hiking alone, I hear a faint tap behind me on a fallen log or a branch, never close enough to be a threat, close enough to be a reminder. It could be the wind. It could be a deer. It could be a man that the forest keeps, pacing, checking doors that no longer open. I live with that small, sharp curiosity and fear now. It has altered how I move through the world. Slower, more careful, less willing to leave curtains open or doors unlocked. The thing about fear is that it isn't only about what might harm you, it's about what it changes in you. My aperture tightened. I became less casual. I learned to accept the cost. Better locks, shorter trips, more company when I'm in the woods. It's not living like I used to, but it's a kind of survival that keeps me making pictures and somehow allows me to keep the work honest. Safety is fragile and earned, not owed. Grief and solitude can leave openings that danger notices, so we protect ourselves not from paranoia, but from the real possibility that the world will not always keep its distance. When I was 23, I left Bristol with 2 suitcases and a heart that felt like a bruised apple. I'd spent years under someone else's voice, told what to wear, who to talk to, how to feel, and finally the tremor of panic every time a car slowed behind me became unbearable. Manchester felt like a clean slate, a call center job with night shifts, an upstairs flat that wasn't much but was mine, and Route 87, the night bus that took me home when the office lights dipped and the city smelled like wet concrete and takeaway grease. I learned the timetables, the driver's rhythms, which seats had the least creaks, and which stoplights were merciful. I also learned that late nights taught you things you didn't always want to know, how your own pulse sounded in a silent bus, how a cough in the dark could sound like someone trying to count your ribs. I told my therapist I was safer now, that the distances made it harder for the old life to reach me. She nodded and gave me breathing exercises. I kept doing them, but some habits cling. I still checked over my shoulder. I still felt that small, animal twitch when a shadow matched my pace on the sidewalk. It's easier, in the beginning, to call that paranoia. Later on, you learn it's a matter of listening to the body. The night it happened, rain smudged the city into watercolors. I'd clocked out at midnight and shuffled to the bus stop, umbrella folding in my hand like a tired animal. Route 87 came at past, the fluorescent sign blinking, the driver wringing his gloved hands. He was an older man named Harris. Slow smile, the kind that had been practiced and made spare by years of night shifts. We exchanged the usual small talk at the door. He asked after the night queue and I said it was quiet. The bus smelled of damp fabric and cold metal, like a forgotten coat. I took my usual seat in the middle bench and let the heat from the vents warm my knees. We left the bus station and threaded through industrial streets slick with light. Most nights, the route was a procession of shuttered shops and sleeping cars, the kind of city that breathed out at midnight. Harris drove like he'd done the route 1,000 times, which I imagine he had. But he kept glancing at the side mirrors, and his fingers tapped the steering wheel in a rhythm that matched the rain. I asked him once, light as a joke, "You all right?" He shrugged. "Just the weather, love." But he muttered something under his breath a couple of times, almost a word that didn't land. We passed the terraced houses and then the factories, and the bus jolted over a manhole. That was when I saw him, just a blur at first under a broken street lamp, soaked through, a hood pulled up. He stood perfectly still, like a figure in a ruined painting. Harris slowed and barely whispered, "Not after midnight." I heard the worry in his voice in a way that made my stomach drop. The man lifted a hand in a slow, empty wave. He wasn't asking for a lift. He was asking the bus to stop. There was no one else around. "We don't pick up," Harris said under his breath. The word came out like a rule rather than a policy. The bus didn't stop. He walked beside us then, hitting his stride to keep up, and for a moment he matched the window where I sat. He looked at me. He looked straight at me, and his hands, when they came into view, were covered in long red scratches that traced his knuckles, as if he'd been clinging to something that wouldn't let go. He mouthed something. I couldn't hear it over the hiss of tires and rain, but it was like the sound of a thrown-off shoe. I felt the prickle at the base of my neck, the one that tells you stories and memory are folding into the present. "Drive," I whispered. Harris's foot pushed the pedal. The bus jolted away and I sagged back into the seat, trying to make myself believe it was a man out of a bad night and a streak of bad luck. 10 minutes later, I breathed a little easier, until I saw him again, just up the street. The same posture, the same lifted hand. Impossible, unless we'd turned a corner I didn't remember. The bus passed him and he stepped in time with us, his face suddenly pressed to the glass. I screamed. Harris swore and ran a red light like a man who'd been punched. He swerved, the world tilting in a way that felt like falling without the satisfaction of hitting ground. We hit the stretch near Brickford Station where the tracks run cold and the lights are sticky arteries of orange. The bus shuddered. The overhead lights flickered. For a beat, the interior went soft as a memory. Then a metallic thud thumped on the roof. Lighter than a fist, but heavier than rain. Something moved up there. Harris shouted, "Stay in your seat!" which is what drivers scream when they don't want to tell you the truth. We felt the roof creak, and the emergency hatch began to pull upward, like a trapped thing pushing to get out. My hands were numb as I dialed 999. The call took forever to connect. My voice sounded far away, like someone shouting underwater. The roof clanged again and again, a slow, deliberate percussion that matched the beat of my own pulse. Harris swerved, fishtailed, slammed the bus forward. The hatch thumped back into place, a final angry strike, and then silence dropped on the vehicle like snowfall. When the police arrived, they took statements while we wrapped ourselves in blankets and tried to pretend the light rain didn't feel like the bus was still wet from something. They climbed onto the roof with flashlights and a kind of professional curiosity that lessened fear but didn't erase it. They found boot marks, deep depressions in the softened tar, spaced in a gait that suggested weight and intent. No prints led away. The footprints were complete and then ended at the edge of the roof, as if whoever had been up there had stepped off into nothing. Harris told me, after the officers had gone, about a faded story the drivers swapped like bad jokes. Brickford Station had been the route's undoing once before. Years ago, a man fell from the top of a bus after a dispute, an accident that ended with his body under the wheels. Some drivers called him the late passenger. Others just shut up. Since then, they said, the bus had a way of being watched on the nights when the city turned its face away. I stopped taking Route 87 after that, not because I believed in a ghost with red-scratched hands, but because the world gives you small, insistent reasons to change your routes. I took taxis when I could afford it, walked with friends, and if I had to ride the bus, I scheduled shifts around people I trusted. For months, the memory of his face pressed to the glass haunted me in the way regrets do, sudden and precise. I would find myself pausing under other street lamps, scanning the wet streets, the way you look for a familiar voice in crowded rooms, even though you've promised not to answer anymore. It's tempting to let a single night write the plot of your life. It's tempting to say the city is full of ghosts waiting for the right hour. But the harder truth is simpler. Cities are repositories of old pain. People fall, vanish, get up, and sometimes they leave a pattern behind for the living to trace. Whether the figure was a man who'd slipped from history into the present, or just a drunk with bad timing, it shouldn't have been our burden to feel watched. But once the feeling gets under your skin, it stays. You learn routes you can trust and ones you can't. You learn to call for help instead of trying to pretend you weren't scared. Now when it rains, I lean over my kettle and let the sound fill the apartment. I still check my reflection in the bus window when I catch one, though I don't ride alone much anymore. On the rare nights I do, I sit where I can see the driver and the doors, where the light hits the aisle in a way that makes everything visible. People say if you ignore fear, it shrinks. I don't think that's true. Fear teaches you geometry, which distances keep you safe, which crossings are worth making, and when it's the right time to stop and ask for a light. I didn't stop fearing after that night. I redirected it. I let it be the map. Pay attention to the small alarms, your instincts, and the quiet warnings of people who know the roads. Safety is often a matter of changing routes, speaking up, and honoring the body's honest alarms before they become regrets. The house was supposed to be a clean line on a new page. I'd won the summer's design contract, finally, after years of small, polite commissions and a divorce that had left me hollow in ways I didn't know until I felt them. Winning meant I could afford the hillside place in Redwood Hills, big windows, exposed beams, an honest slate roof that shed rain the way a good building should. I told myself the silence of the neighborhood would be balm. I told myself I'd sleep better without someone else's toothbrush in my bathroom. I didn't tell myself what I hoped the house would do to me, how I wanted it to stitch me back together like one of my blueprints. The first nights were all practical rituals: unpack, catalog, hang art. I walked the property at dusk, admiring how the land sloped into foggy pines. The house settled into its frame the way old houses do small creaks, the soft pop of cooling wood. I liked that. It felt honest. But on the fourth night, while I was revising a late-night set of sketches, the hallway camera started pinging my phone. A motion alert, I thought, and glanced at the feed. The hallway was empty. The light over the stairs that I never left on, blinked on, then off. The app showed motion, shaky shadows, but my live feed displayed nothing but a dark corridor, the grain of the floorboards catching the camera's infrared. I pinched the bridge of my nose and told myself the camera was glitchy. Designers rely on systems. Systems fail. I hit ignore and went back to my lines. At 2:03 a.m., the light over the stairwell awakened like a bad memory. It clicked on and stayed steady, casting the dark house in a thin cylinder of yellow. I froze mid-gesture, pencil held above tracing paper. The security app buzzed again. New face detected at front door. I opened the feed. A man stood framed in the doorway like a photograph, tall, coat collar turned up against an imagined wind. His face was blurred in a way I didn't expect from a camera 2 floors away, like the pixels were smeared by a hand. He wasn't moving. He simply listened, head tilted as if trying to place a sound. But I had heard nothing enter. I had not heard the door. The front door feed showed no mechanical disturbance. The exterior cameras showed only the empty gravel drive and a hazy moon. The app's alerting tone was clinical until another notification arrived. Unknown face detected upstairs hallway. I went cold, from the soles of my feet to the back of my neck. It was a stupid, overconfident move to check the monitors. The rational part of me wanted evidence, to prove this was a false alarm. The louder, more animal part of me wanted the house to remain a question. I grabbed a drafting ruler from the desk, a long, cold slat of metal, and edged the study door closed. The knob twisted once under my fingers, a soft, patient turning. A voice, low and even, breathed through the door. "Nathan, wrong house." It's surprising what thin comforts you grab in a moment like that. The ruler felt ridiculous and providential at once. I pressed my shoulder against the study door and peered out a crack. The hallway light fizzed and the shadows in its pool stretched oddly, not like human limbs but like curtains in a draft no one could find. The camera dashboard on my phone continued to spit alerts, faces, motion, anomalies, and at 2:06 a.m., every interior camera went dark at once. No feed, no history. The app logged a sudden loss of signal, as if someone had yanked wires out of the house's backbone. I called 911 with 2 fingers shaking and explained what oddities my security system was recording. They advised me to stay put. Officers would be en route. I moved from room to room with my absurd ruler, checking locks, peeking at windows. The front door stood shut when I last saw it. I remember that as if it were a promise. But when the patrol car arrived, 2 officers with flashlights and the flat, efficient calm of people who have seen too many late-night calls, there was a wobble in the story. They opened the front door and found it wide. They found no forced entry, no footprints on the concrete, no disturbance on the gravel approach. The exterior cameras showed nothing beyond the trees. Inside, though, something else had happened. The hallway light that had gone on by itself burned steady over stairs that weren't completely right. When the senior officer checked the internal recordings, he frowned and said, "All interior cameras disabled around 2:06. That's odd." He didn't say haunted. He didn't say paranormal. He said, odd. It's a better word for things that don't have convenient labels. The rational parts of me assembled themselves like scaffolding. Wiring fault, electromagnetic interference, someone tampered with the system from the outside. The police had theories, signal spoofing, a local prankster. But when they called in a tech to check the hub, he told them the interior network had not been accessed electronically. The feeds had gone dark in a way that suggested a localized power draw or an internal disruption. That's technical gibberish that translates to something more basic. The house had been silenced from the inside. After the officers left, I packed a bag. I called my contractor and asked for emergency modifications, upgraded locks, a security upgrade, a physical check of the wiring. The contractor was kind and professional, but when he walked the land with me, he said nothing for a long time, eyes on a slope of trees. Later, he told me he'd run into an old neighbor on his way home, who mentioned the lot, an asylum annex burned in the early 1900s. Records sparse, names smudged. Old stories. He shrugged. Folklore fills gaps. Folklore, I thought, is what people tell when they can't explain the stomach clench of a place that has history in its bones. I slept that week with the downstairs lights on. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. An automated system scan finished, cameras reinitialized. I checked the footage from earlier that night before the blackout. Tiny distortions in the frame, reflections in my hallway mirror that blurred like brushstrokes. I took a breath and zoomed into one freeze frame. At the edge of the glass, in a sliver of reflection, there was something an oval where a face could be, milky and moving with the light. Or maybe it was an artifact. Maybe grief makes you see ghosts where you need them. My divorce file and the dismantled pieces of my life sat on my table like evidence that I'd been living in the wrong kind of silence for years. I moved out within a week. Practicality 1, work schedules, a desire for sleep without the house asking questions I didn't want to answer. I thought leaving would sever it cleanly. It didn't. Years later, I still have a skin-deep caution that makes me check the corners twice and leave one lamp on when I'm in hotel rooms. I look at my old project photos for worksite shots, before and after frames, and sometimes, in a polished pane or a darkened puddle, there is a blur like the one in my hallway mirror. I zoom in until the pixels collapse into noise and then the mind wants to give them meaning. People have asked me if I believe the house was haunted. I say I don't know. That's the safest answer. It distances me from certainty, and certainty is an attribute I do not own anymore. What I do know is how small things accumulate into fear. A light switching on, a door turning, a camera that sees faces you can't see in plain sight. What I remember most is the voice at the study door, soft, patient, wrong in a way I still can't name, and the way it used one of my own lost names, as if it had been keeping tabs on the shape of my life. I still design buildings, I still draft, but I return from job sites earlier than I used to, and I sleep with a cheap lamp on the nightstand. It's not architecture that taught me to do that. It was waking up in a house that seemed to pretend it had always been waiting for me to make a mistake. Houses inherit histories, and we inherit the consequences. Never assume a place's silence is empty. Sometimes it's listening. Long before I learned to fear basements and flickering lights, I used to think the scariest thing in life was leaving someone you once loved. Breakups always left me hollow, unsure, drifting. But leaving Mason was different. He made me doubt my own instincts so many times that when I finally walked out, I didn't recognize my own reflection for weeks. His way of twisting reality, of making everything my fault, left a mark I kept trying to scrub out of my head. By the time I turned 25, I just wanted a life that didn't feel like a maze he designed. Brooklyn felt like a clean slate, loud, crowded, alive. My new apartment wasn't much. Top floor of a brownstone that sagged like it needed a long nap, but it was mine. A single room with a bed tucked near the window, a tiny kitchenette, and a crooked fire escape that rattled whenever the wind kicked up. I didn't care. It was freedom. The only thing I couldn't stand was the laundry room. It was in a basement that felt older than the entire building, always damp, always smelling faintly like mildew and rusted metal. I used to joke that if a monster existed anywhere in New York, it would start in that basement. I wasn't really joking. Moving to a new city is lonelier than people admit. You imagine instant reinvention, a new version of yourself who fits in effortlessly. But reality is quieter than that. Most nights I worked late doing graphic design revisions for a downtown firm too cheap to hire a second artist. By the time I got home, the building hallways were hushed, everyone tucked away behind their apartment doors. That Friday night was no different. I remember pausing in my apartment doorway, laundry basket hip-checked against me, thinking about whether I should wait until morning. But the clothes smelled like Subway sweat and spilled coffee, and I wanted them clean, so I went. The stairwell groaned with each step down. The basement door resisted when I pushed it open, like it didn't want me going inside. The overhead bulb flickered, humming faintly, casting the room in a jittery orange glow. Concrete floors, exposed pipes, old insulation sagging from the ceiling, every inch felt like a place where bad memories could hide. I set the basket down and exhaled. "Just do it, Robin," I whispered to myself. 10 minutes. I started loading the washing machine, tossing in jeans and shirts, trying not to pay attention to the way the shadows crawled along the back wall, each time the light flickered. When I reached for my detergent, something caught my eye, a bottle on the storage shelf, squeezed so hard it bulged at the sides, blue liquid dripping from the cap. I froze. I hadn't touched it yet. I stared for a long moment, trying to rationalize it. Maybe another tenant dropped it earlier. Maybe the bottle leaked on its own. Maybe the basement was damp enough to warp plastic. But the drip was fresh, glistening, too recent. Behind me, the basement door clicked softly. My heartbeat jumped into my throat. I turned, expecting to see someone coming down the stairs, but the doorway was empty. The door, which I knew I had closed fully, now hung open by a few inches. "Okay," I whispered. "That's weird." I moved toward the door, reaching out to shut it again, when I heard slow, heavy footsteps overhead right above the stairs. The boards creaked like someone was standing there, shifting their weight. Then silence. No voices, no movement, just the hum of the flickering light. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Typical. The basement was practically underground. That's when the washing machine behind me beeped loud, sharp, sudden. I jumped and spun around, hand against my chest. "Jesus Christ," I muttered. "Get it together." But then I noticed them. Mud tracks. Fresh, wet, smeared from the basement window across the concrete floor, straight toward the old boiler in the corner. Someone had come in from outside. My throat tightened. "Hello?" I said. My voice sounded too small. "Who's there?" No answer. But something shifted behind the boiler, metal pipes giving a faint rattle. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but the stairs were on the far side of the room, past the boiler, past whoever was hiding there. I scanned the room for anything to defend myself with and grabbed the closest thing, a long metal hanger from a drying rack. Useless, really. But it felt better than having empty hands. The breathing behind the boiler grew clearer. Slow, controlled, like someone waiting. A shadow moved, tall, hunched, deliberate. Ice shot down my spine. I bolted. My sneakers slapped the concrete as I sprinted toward the stairs. The light flickered wildly, plunging the basement into momentary darkness. I heard movement behind me, a scrape, then footsteps breaking into a run. "Hey," a voice barked, hoarse and ragged. "Don't run." I locked the door. I didn't even process the words. I hit the bottom step and scrambled upward, gripping the railing like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. When I reached the basement door, I braced for it to be locked. It wasn't. The knob turned easily under my hand. I shoved the door open and slammed it behind me with a force that rattled the frame. "Help!" I yelled, stumbling into the hallway. "Someone's down there." My neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, opened her door with wide, startled eyes. "Sweetheart, what happened?" "Call 911, I gasped. There's someone in the basement with a crowbar." She grabbed her phone without question. Doors cracked open down the hallway, residents peeking out as I tried to steady my shaking hands. Behind the basement door, the silence was suffocating. No footsteps, no voice, just the weight of knowing someone was still down there, trapped between concrete walls and a window he'd crawled through once already. The police arrived, fast sirens slicing through the night, boots echoing up the stairwell. They searched the basement with flashlights and drawn weapons. I stood behind the yellow tape they'd set at the top of the stairs, hugging myself as the officers moved around below. Clear. one of them called. Another officer approached me. "You said the man spoke to you?" "He said he locked the door," I whispered. "But it wasn't. I got out." The officer nodded, jaw tight. Window was pried open, footprints leading back out. "He probably realized you weren't alone anymore, and took off." "So he's still out there?" I asked. "For now," the officer said. "We'll sweep the area." I watched mud drip from the edges of the broken window frame. It made my stomach twist. When everything quieted down, I went back to my apartment, still shaking. I sat on the edge of my bed, replaying the basement scene like a broken tape. The mud, the breathing, the voice, the crowbar. No matter how many times I blinked, his shadow stayed burned into the back of my mind. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building felt like footsteps. Every flicker of headlights outside painted a stranger on my wall. I kept telling myself I was safe. I didn't believe it. 2 weeks passed before the police contacted me again. I was eating lunch at my desk when my phone rang. Unknown NYPD number. "Miss Hale, this is Detective Ramirez. We wanted to update you on your case." My stomach clenched. "You found him?" "Yes, ma'am. Arrested this morning. Serial burglar active in your area for months. We recovered tools matching your description, including a crowbar." My breath left me in a shaky exhale. Relief, sharp and dizzying. "Was he living nearby?" "Unfortunately, yes. Just a few blocks from your building. We believe he used basements and maintenance rooms as entry points. You weren't targeted specifically. He was looking for any access he could find." I should have felt better knowing it wasn't personal. I didn't. "Thank you," I said quietly. "Really." When the call ended, I stared at my computer screen, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. It didn't matter that he'd been caught. It didn't matter that he hadn't known my name or my apartment number or who I was. He'd been close enough to touch me, close enough to lock the door behind me. From that night on, I never did laundry after dark again. I never walked down those creaking stairs without gripping my phone and checking every corner first. Sometimes, even now, if a washing machine beeps unexpectedly, I feel that old terror prickle at the back of my neck. Brooklyn still feels like home, but I learned something important in that basement, something I should have learned long before Mason twisted my sense of danger. Trust your instincts. They're louder than fear, sharper than doubt, and they speak long before danger shows its face. When something feels wrong, listen. Your instincts exist to protect you, and trusting them can be the difference between walking away safely and becoming a story someone else has to finish. Long before I started traveling with a road case full of microphones and cables, sound was the thing that held me together. I grew up with headphones on, taping mix after mix of late-night radio and old studio sessions, learning how to find clarity in the mess. In college, I wired up dorm rooms and then small clubs. After graduation, I got lucky, a studio internship that turned into a job that turned into a lifestyle. The year I lost Mark, my best friend and the other half of our little team, everything else narrowed. He'd been setting up a mic stand for a live take when a cheap stand slipped and sent a cable whipping across the room. He was the kind of guy who laughed through pain and told the worst jokes, and I watched him go down and somehow knew the sound of everything breaking. I started sleep ever since. Loud things made me flinch. Long silences made me think of angles and blame. The guilt never left. I never asked the question out loud, did I push too hard? Did I miss something? Instead, I learned to work late, to travel, to keep moving. Travel blurred things, airports, hotel rooms, conference halls, no single place to trudge through memory. Sound editing keeps your hands busy. It keeps your head from leaning too far into the dark. Soul was supposed to be distraction. LED panels and firmware updates, and half a dozen panels about immersive audio. The horizon view felt safe in the way business hotels do, brushed metal, neutral art, and a functional quiet that encouraged sleep. Room 1712 had a window that looked over an alley, and a hum from the AC that, for the first night, soothed me into a few hours. On night 3, insomnia turned the hum into a companion. I worked through mixes on my laptop, headphones off to better hear the low room tone, when my interface picked up a narrow band, high-frequency tone, layered with what sounded like breath and a whisper. It looped every 10 seconds. At first, I assumed RF interference, hotel wireless, maybe a stray handset or a nearby radio. I unplugged gear, pulled power, moved the laptop away from the router. The sound stayed. It was cleaner in the waveform than my sleep-deprived brain wanted to admit. A modulated carrier with a faint spectral smear that looked like a human voice tucked under noise. The metadata flagged the origin as room 402. That was a detail that should have felt ordinary hotels assign networks and devices all the time, but the front desk's voice over the phone cut it into something else. Room 402 has been closed since the fire, the clerk said. No power, renovations still pending. We don't even charge it on the system. The rational mind stitched possibilities, a mislabeled node, a ghosted MAC address, a maintenance radio bleeding into my preamp. But grief has a way of inviting nonsense. The whisper in the loop thin, brittle brushed the line between audio artifact and plea. I froze on the phrase like I'd been thrown. Help, it said, buried under static. Curiosity isn't the same as bravery. It's an itch you have to scratch. I grabbed my jacket and took the elevator down. The fourth-floor hallway smelled faintly of paint and ozone. The lights flickered in that uneasy way old fluorescent circuits do when you tap a wall switch. Room 402's door had been sealed with warning tape. The tape had been sliced with a box cutter and peeled back. There were scuff marks near the threshold. Up close, the seal looked recent, edges still ragged. I held my phone out like a cheap flashlight and listened. At first there was nothing but the building's infrastructure, pipes, distant elevators, the soft creak of settling. Then something moved inside the suite. A slow sound, like something being dragged across a dry floor. My chest tightened. I told myself the sensible things: construction crew, a contractor, a hotel employee, but the hair along my arms tightened anyway. I didn't know whether I hoped to find someone in need or to find a malfunction to put away like an explained ghost. Either way, my feet betrayed me and backed away. The door creaked inward, just a sliver. And cold, burnt-tinged air dragged past me. Is someone there? I heard myself say. The question, half defiance, half invitation. A voice answered, thin, insisted, as if it had been waiting. Don't leave me again. I hadn't told anyone about the last time I'd left Mark alone in the control room to grab coffee. I hadn't told anyone about my hands trembling over the faders afterward, about how I'd gone back and found him slumped by the amp, the lights still on, and the soprano hum in the room that never quite left me. The words were private and impossible, and they hit me like a cheap punch. I bolted, not for curiosity, but for the hope of survival. The hallway lights fluttered like bad film. I hit the elevator button once, then again, fingers numb. The sound in the room, whatever it was, grew ragged, then a scuffing that moved toward the door. When the elevator arrived, I stepped in and thought for the briefest flash I was being watched. A thin silhouette stood in the doorway, head tilted like someone listening to a new song and not wanting to change the needle. The doors closed. In the safety of the elevator, I told myself it had to be a squatter, some tech crawling around with old equipment, or a maintenance worker using a radio. The security team takes these things seriously in a big city hotel. When I reached the lobby, the front desk was all professionalism and taut concern. They promised to sweep the wing, to check the sealed room, to call me back. They did. They called twice, no one inside. The room had no power. The tape had been disturbed, but there was no recent motion and no sign of anyone living there. I listened to the sound files on my laptop. The whisper was there untouched, and at the end of the file, after my panicked silence, another breathless, grating phrase sat under the static. Found you. I tried to find the technical explanation like a man hunting for clean facts to bat back any superstitious fear. Maybe someone was playing with an old wireless loopback, an amateur with a radio transmitter and a taste for creepy samples. Maybe the building's old phone system picked up interference and rendered it in that warped way only digital gear can make eerie. The detective part of my brain, trained by years of critical listening, wanted proof of anything but the supernatural. The human part wanted absolution. I wanted to chase down the voice and tell it, it wasn't your fault. I wanted the voice to say, I forgive you. Sound, after all, is how I fix things. You get close enough, you find the hiss and pluck it out, you align the phase and the problem is solved. But explaining doesn't always heal. Security confirmed, an arrest 2 days later, someone seen around the property, carrying a crowbar, a trespasser who'd been sleeping in storage spaces and crawling through vents. They'd charged him with burglary and trespassing. The front desk thanked me and said they were increasing patrols. The metadata on my audio tracks remained stubborn and irrelevant. A room number that should have had no power. A whisper that said things a living person had no reason to say. And the shape of my own memory folded into it. I switched rooms that night, then hotels the next morning. I stopped wandering after midnight. I started leaving my gear powered down and the headphones in my bag, less willing to poke into unknown signals that might carry the weight of memory. My work slowed. For a while I told myself it was jet lag, that Soul had simply been a bad reset. I kept editing, but never the kind that required late-night dives into archived files. I stopped opening unknown audio at night. What I kept thinking about, in the small hours, was how often danger hides inside the familiar. Mark had died doing the thing we loved, in a room we both trusted. It taught me how fragile the boundary between safe and unsafe can be. The thing you think protects you becomes the vessel for loss. The whisper, whether squatter, wiring oddity, or a cracked fragment of someone else's grief, was a mirror I didn't want to look into. Don't leave me again. Found you. Help. I still mix other people's recordings for a living. I still tighten a gain knob and listen for rumble at 2 in the morning. But I learned something practical and human that Soul hammered in. Sometimes your ears tell you more than fact, and sometimes they tell you what your heart already knows. When a sound rakes past the place where memory still opens, you can chase it until it makes sense, or you can step away and keep breathing. There's courage in both. Listen to your instincts and respect the weight of grief. Chasing every echo won't fix the past, and sometimes the kindest act is to protect yourself from sounds that reopen wounds. Long before I ever thought I'd come back to the farmhouse for good, that field behind the orchard lived as a small, private mystery inside my head, one of those things you tell yourself you'll outgrow. My cousin and I were 10 when we first saw the lanterns gliding through the trees. They moved with a smoothness that didn't fit the clumsy way kids held flashlights, all 3 of them keeping exactly the same distance from one another. We ran home, breathless, expecting adults to clap us on the back and laugh about a prank. Instead, they said, "Must have been juveniles," and that was the end of it for them. For me, it never ended. If anything, being told it was nothing made the memory louder, like a record you can't stop. When Mom died, the town expected me to sell the place and go wherever the work went. But the idea of leaving a house that had my mother's smell in the kitchen and the creak of her chair in the den felt like abandoning something alive. So, I moved back. At 32, I had a business I liked, custom woodworking, and I wanted the quiet to build benches and tables again. The farmhouse needed work. The orchard needed pruning. The field needed something I hadn't named until the first night I was alone in the house and the motion light outside went on, then off, then on again, like a breath. On that first week, little things happened. My hammer moved a few inches on the workbench, a smudge of dirt on the back doorstep, apple branches shaken, though the air held absolutely still. I told myself animals or wind, though I never saw the animals that would leave such clean, human-shaped smears. I told myself reasoned things to keep from waking to the remembered smooth float of the lanterns from childhood. The farmhouse has a lot of corners and a lot of memory. It's forgiving in the way old things are. I wanted to forgive it back. One night I was carving a chair leg when the outside light flicked on. It felt like the house was sighing. From the kitchen window I watched the orchard sway, the far row only, the ones closest to the field moving as if something walked between them. I wiped my hands and stepped outside. The field beyond the trees was a void. The air tasted like rain, even though the forecast promised none. Then, 3 points of light appeared near the tree line and moved toward the house in perfect sync. They held their triangle tight, sliding across the land without sound. The memory of the kid's flashlight prank dissolved in the face of something that was older than pranks. I staggered back into the house and shut the door. The lights halted at the trees, one brightening like an eye blinking in slow motion. I whispered, "No, not again," because the word that came out of my mouth was a map. It linked the boy I was and the man I had become. The porch steps creaked heavy, deliberate right after. A shadow crossed the window, and something tapped the glass. Long, slow, a sound like a nail checking for rot. I dialed 911 with hands that felt like lead. The line gave me static as an answer. Someone else in town had told me the signal there was patchy. It's the kind of practical detail you think is irrelevant until the practical detail becomes what separates a person from being alone. The tapping moved around the house, then up the back where the orchard met the field, like someone mapping every window. I remember hiding in the pantry because it was small and felt safe, and because hiding in a small space makes your breathing part of the plan. The house groaned as footsteps paced the porch, and then the yard. Silence fell so abruptly my ears rang. 30 minutes later, the sheriff knocked. They found 3 lanterns in the field, old iron things, corroded, still warm to the touch. No footprints, no sign of anyone leaving or arriving. The lanterns looked as if carried by hands that never trod on the soil. The deputy had a polite, practiced skepticism and printed a small report. When he left, with his cruiser taillights disappearing down the lane, the orchard hummed back into its usual quiet, and for a while I did not sleep at all. Months went by. People at the diner told stories about the procession of lights, about how their granddads used to steer clear of Elmwick at night. A historian from the county museum found me on a slow afternoon and offered old newspapers and transcribed testimony. There had been, in the 1800s, a small group that met in the field rituals with lantern formations, some members missing after a rash of secrecy and accusations. It was easy to listen to those stories and think of archaeology of remnants, burned lanterns, rituals gone wrong. It was harder to listen when the midday sun slipped and the far orchard trees would sometimes sway again, precisely when I thought sleep might finally come. I tried to be practical. I built heavy shutters for every window, bolting them from the inside with iron locks that matched the farmhouse's bones. I wired motion lights to a system that would trigger an alarm on my phone. I set out cameras, though the cell service was spotty, and a camera without a signal feels like a camera with blind eyes. I planted motion-sensing lights in the field edge. Each defensive measure made me feel marginally safer and marginally more like someone waiting for the theater to open. The last time a light glinted between the trees, it skirted the camera's field of vision like it knew the lines of the stage. Neighbors offered their own kinds of counsel. Move the work inside, they said. Sell the land and buy something safer, they said. My cousin, the one who saw the lights with me as a boy, told me to let it go. We were kids, he said. You let your head make monsters. For years I took that like a prescription, until the night the tapping returned and my 911 call again burst into static. When something small and mechanical interrupts the most human of calls, you stop trusting infrastructure as an ally. It occurred to me that the real terror wasn't necessarily the lights or the lanterns, but the way the town and its grown-ups shrank the experience, how people smoothed over what children saw because the alternative was messy and frightening. I had been told not to worry my elders' minds, to accept the official explanation. That dismissal hardened inside me into a muscle that tensed at lantern light and a habit of checking every dark corner twice. The rusted lanterns in the field were physical proof that something had once held ritual in that place. And the fact that no footprints showed up on the deputy's boot prints made the idea of a rational world wobble. Years later, when the historian traced a pattern of disappearances tied to the old cult, the news should have been a conclusion. It was not. Knowledge didn't erase the noise that sometimes woke me at midnight, the soft metallic clinking like chains on old boots, a procession of lights winking at the orchard line. The shutters worked, the locks held. Family friends told me I was healthier now. 2 cups of coffee a day, a caller at noon, plans for selling some of the wooded acreage. They wanted my life back in the catalog of normalcy. On nights when the orchard moves and the far trees sway, I stand at the window with my hands on the sill and do something simple and human. I remember the boy who ran back from the tree line with his cousin and the adults who shrugged and labeled their fear as imagination. I feel the way that dismissal stings, how being told your fear is a children's story can make you carry it alone. The lights might be the residue of a belief, some group's echo pressing against the present, or they might be something about which my neighborhood and I will never acquire a satisfying explanation. Either way, I learned to act like a neighbor to my own fear, lock the shutters, stop the doubts from breeding, treat the past like an unfinished job that needs practical fixes. I still wake to the metallic clink sometimes, a sound braided with memory and the uncanny. My bench shop hums during the day. At night, the house listens. I work with wood because it's honest grain and resistance, knots and predictable breaks. The field behind the orchard is not honest. It keeps moving just beyond the edge of what I can measure. Trust your instincts and protect what keeps you safe. Being told you're imagining something doesn't make your fear false. Sometimes it's the community's way of denying what it can't face. Build shutters, set the alarms, but don't ignore the small truths your own memory insists are real.